So we have covered the domestic policy of Reagan. Now we shall look at his foreign policy. So a basic rundown of his generalities of Reagan's foreign policy was an escalation of Cold War tensions due to Reagan's anti-communist rhetoric, with his famous naming of the USSR being an evil empire, as well as the focus of evil in the modern world. This was the baseline of his policy. As well as with many other anti-communist US presidents, he was very keen on securing his backyard, that being Latin America, against governments that are communist or sympathetic to socialism. This whole idea of Latin America being the US's backyard stems from the Monroe Doctrine, which was a doctrine made in the early 19th century by James Monroe, the President of the US, that states four main points. Number one, the US would not interfere in the internal wars between European powers. Number two, the US would recognize and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. Number three, the Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And number four, any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the US. This core policy of the US, which was made 200 years ago, still is today felt, and was felt during the Reagan administration. In a sense, during the Cold War, it was co-opted by the anti-communist outlook of the US government, culminating to create Operation Condor, whereby multiple coups were planted by US intelligence committees such as the CIA to supplant any government, communist or sympathetic to socialism in the Western Hemisphere. The operation started in 1975 and ended after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This was just the general context of the political climate during Reagan's presidency. So now let's get into the details of his foreign policy. In Afghanistan, during the Reagan administration, a primary focus was the support of the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation and war of Afghanistan, which lasted from 1979 to 1989. The background context of the Soviet-Afghan War was that in the early 70s, the Afghan state was a standard republic of a similar system of that of France and the US, under its first and last president of this government, Daoud Khan. Preceding the Republic of 1973 to 1978, there was a parliamentary monarchy. At the head was the monarch as well as the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister was Daoud Khan, and he in fact orchestrated the entire military coup d'etat because of his dissatisfaction with the parliamentary monarchy and its social and economic progress. Because of this, he orchestrated the coup d'etat. This new government tried to modernize the country to the 20th century by developing its industries as well as getting its people out of the agricultural jobs, which consisted of over 50% of the population, and pushing more and more people into cities. The Republic was then supplanted after the Saudi Revolution of 1978, which was supported and funded by the Soviets. This government was very frail, as it was under attack by many rebels, which were funded by Pakistan, the US, China, and Iran. These rebels then organized under one banner, which were to be called the Mujahideen. The war was fought for 9 years, but the outcome was a tactical retreat of the Soviets, due to the war being basically impossible to win because of the terrain of Afghanistan, which made guerrilla warfare an unbreakable strategy, whereby you would just retreat into the mountains every time they skirmished with the Soviet army. And with the support of the Mujahideen by the US, it was a sort of Vietnam for the Soviets. The big problem that I avoided was the realization that the US policy by Reagan, calling the Mujahideen soldiers brave and funding their movement, indirectly led to 9/11 and the subsequent creation of the Taliban and ISIS. The US created the war by winning another war, It just shows you that if you support a repressive government or dictatorship, it can bite you in the ass. Another big focus for the foreign policy of Reagan was the destruction of the newly formed Sandinista government. And that may sound like hyperbole, but trust me, it ain't. The context of this situation happened after a long civil war with the dictator Somoza in 1979 of July, where the Sandinistas took power. This made the Carter administration meet up with the leaders of the Sandinistas, those being Daniel Ortega, Sergio Ramirez, Alfonso Robelo. They discussed over the fact of giving aid to the whole of Latin America and subsequently the Nicaraguan government. The deal was set that the US was going to give $75 million in aid, but only after adding tough restrictions to the sale of Nicaraguan weapons to El Salvador. After Reagan took office in 1981, he negotiated with the Honduran generals to get the Contra started, and using Argentina as a training base as well as a proxy, due to the optical problem and hysteria over a second Vietnam. As a side note, to show just how much everybody hated the Sandinista government in the Reagan administration, the Secretary of the State George Shultz called them a cancer right here on our landmass. The State Department also boasted in 1981 that it would turn Nicaragua into the Albania of Central America, meaning the total isolation of Nicaragua by every state in the UN. In 1987, in August, a peace plan was devised between the two sides, whereby the Sandinistas were to postpone the election of 1984 in exchange for the demilitarization of the Contras. And so the Sandinista government accepted this deal, because it feared that it didn't really have another choice in the matter. But the US did not bat an eye, and so it just supplied the Contras even more, and announced that were the Sandinistas win the election, the embargo and terrorist attacks via the Contras were to remain. The Sandinistas lost the elections, but it wasn't surprising due to the conditions, even though they got 40% of the vote. In 1985, the Iran-Contra affair happened, whereby Reagan's administration sold missiles to the newly formed Islamic Republic of Iran, so that the American hostages located in Lebanon were to be freed. The money that was accumulated by the sale of these missiles was then given to the Contras in Nicaragua. This affair was secret and didn't go through Congress. It was later found out in 1986 when a helicopter was shot down in Nicaragua, whereby a soldier professed what happened. And so it was found out as a scandal during the Reagan administration. But later, George Bush, when he was elected in 1990, gave amnesty to all recipients that were part of this scandal. In Europe, the Reaganite policy was simple: to denounce and push communism as far east as possible. A special thing that Reagan is noted for in Europe is his famous speech whereby he pronounced that Gorbachev should tear this wall down. Specifically, he meant the Berlin Wall. Beside his speech on tearing down the wall, Reagan mostly followed in the footsteps of US presidents in the past, but with more vigor and as well as more radically anti-communist rhetoric. China is interesting because after its revolution of 1948 to 1949 and the establishment of the PRC, it sided with the Soviet Union and formed an alliance, but after political and ideological differences started to divide Maoism from Stalinism, and when Stalin's death occurred in 1953 and Khrushchev took power and adopted a peaceful coexistence policy with the West, China dropped all ties with the USSR. Then in the 70s, the Nixon administration developed somewhat ties with the Chinese government, visiting Beijing himself, Nixon, once. Ties broke down during the Reagan administration because of his accepting of Taiwan being the true China. This was unacceptable to the PRC, and so China broke ties with the US. That is all. All the main foreign policies of Reagan's administration. Though there were some cameos that I should have probably included, like the invasion of Grenada, I hope that you have learned something. And I hope that this makes you want to research more on your own. And as always, have a good day.